Vincent and I are very excited to talk to you guys about scaffolded single-point rubrics or single-point scaffolded rubrics. It's going to be both. And we're going to have a session later on today where we actually have a teacher that is actually using these in the 6th grade about being able to give meaningful, authentic feedback. And so, Vincent, are you ready for this?
Yes, good morning, everybody. So today we're going to be looking at 2 different rubrics that we have, very similar in style and structure. The first one is the one we're going to spend the bulk of our time in to demonstrate that style and structure, and that is our Formative Performance Task Single Point Scaffolded Rubric. It's a mouthful for our grades 6 through 12 here. If you're looking at our rubric, this is a Google Doc version of it that you see on the right. Looks like there's a lot going on. All the rubric fits on one single page. There is a lot happening here, but I really want to focus that there's really just 2 sections on here that we're looking at, and we tried to include those sections right here. The first one that you see is that we have our formative performance task at the very top that teachers would choose between. And then the second section that you see here is our assessment criteria. Both of these sections are what we're going to go into more detail in this presentation. Before we talk about our task section, these are action verbs that you see in social studies standards, words that are cueing teachers up within the standards on what they should be doing. You see a whole variety of words, and what we've tried to do is organize some of this language into what the processes actually are. So if you look here on the left, you see that there's some language that goes with thinking about assessing and evaluating and analyzing, but kind of hard to demonstrate how students are analyzing or examining. We have some words that and language that is about doing, which is using and applying and gathering and so on. And we've organized some of the language under the task over here that can really help demonstrate that. So how would you demonstrate and assess or an analyze or create or develop? Our position with our rubric is that the language that you see on the far right here is some of the language you see within the standards on how we would go about doing that. And you could do that through a description, an explanation, a claim, or an argument. So you could develop an idea through the disciplinary lens, through an explanation. You can generate it through an argument or so on. That the tasks are really how the student would be demonstrating that knowledge and that way of thinking. We've actually added one in that you're going to see on our scaffold, which is generalizations, and we insert that between description and explanation, simply because we see that as a logical gap between the 2. So this is the top part that you would see on our rubric, and this is an annotated version of that rubric in that top section that you see there. As you can see, this is a formative performance task. Meaning that this is the task that a teacher would do if they are looking to assess for a given supporting question, which would be scaffolding up to a compelling question for the end of a unit, which would be their summative performance task. This we organize through descriptions, generalizations, explanations, and claims. You will also see that this is scaffolded, so we have our stair-step model here that we have, in which you would move from descriptions to generalizations and so on. You'd be scaffolding these skills throughout. We have kind of brief and concise instructions that the teacher would be selecting which task that the students would be doing. And then the bottom part where you see second, you would see that they would be determining the criteria, and that will be on the other slide that we'll discuss. Where I'd like to spend a little bit more time is looking at these task types. The task types, again, are coming straight from our standards. And the language that we pulled, we've tried to align the language straight from our standards that we have, that you will see in 6th grade through 12th grade. So we begin with description because we believe that this is the fundamental level in which students can begin to be able to describe, and we define that as an account detailing relevant characteristics on the topic. This would be the starting point in which they could work on these tasks, in which they could demonstrate some of those other acting verbs in that process. They would move up to generalizations, which are summaries and main ideas. As you see, we've tried to underline key components of even the definition to help bring focus for the students and the teachers themselves. We have explanations that we move up to, and then ultimately moving toward claims. In social studies, we are about making arguments and taking an action. But before you're able to make an argument being a series of claims, we would see that you would need to be able to make a claim. And to backwards plan that even more, to make a claim, we see that you would need to be able to make an explanation, and then a summary or a main idea, and then down to a description. So as you see the scaffold progressing up, we also consider this as backwards planning, with the goal being an argument. And this scaffold is what would help build the student skills and communicating conclusion skills within our standards up to that argumentation level that we're really looking for. The next section that you see here is the criteria scaffold level. Now, what you see here is the criteria, which is actually on the second half, or if you're looking at the full document of the rubric, it would be the bottom part of the rubric here. And these criteria are accurate, clear, evidenced, and reasoned. And what we're trying to do here is signal to the students which criteria level they could be assessed on. So we try to provide a lot of flexibility within our rubric for the different needs that our students might have and the different levels in which their students have, so they can move easily within one rubric to do a whole variety of different things. So we provide just a few options with our 1, 2, 3 down below that this slide is on what they could do. For a description, we make the claim that we would be able to do accurate and clear on a description. And what the teacher could do is ask the students to circle a 1 or circle a 2. And there's a variety of ways in which we could do this. They could have the entire class do description and really focus on trying to be accurate for that description. They could have the students do accurate and clear for a description, but then circle the one that they're really good at target for assessment that day. So the students could have an opportunity to practice all the assessment criteria skills while just really honing in on an assessment for that formative task on one specific skill while they're still having an opportunity to practice. But what you can also do is vary this up for students and say some students might be ready for a description where they would be doing it at a criteria level 1, which would be, again, accuracy. But other students, maybe 20 other students in the class, are ready to move forward on being accurate and clear. So this demonstration that you see here at the top allows that flexibility for individual students can do things as a whole group, as a whole class, but the teacher can customize that scaffold for the student so they can have the opportunity to really hone in on the skill or the assessment criteria, as we call it, that they would really want to focus on. And because this is, again, on one rubric page, we can also vary up the task for this also. So if some students are still working on mastery for description, other students might be ready for generalizations. And on one rubric, one page that all the students are using, some students could be working on a generalization for a task, same subject, same content, same lesson, while other students that still need to work on their skills on description could still be on that level. So we're scaffolding the skills based on the individual needs and requirements that the students and our standards are requesting. Brian, do you have any comments and thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, look, this seems super complex, right? But so is scaffolding learning in the students' minds. And the idea that what we've seen from teachers, one of our favorite exercises is to have them just define explanation, right? We did this just the other day with some schools. And what we found is that per the teacher, there was a different definition of explanation. How in the world then can you provide equitable feedback if everyone has different definitions for explanation, right? So the very first thing this rubric starts to do is define those tasks which everyone needs to coalesce around, right? Whatever it might be, right? But we're saying that these are the 4 major elements that help students build better arguments over time. The second piece of this is that we all know, right, that a rubric needs to make sure that it provides that equitable understanding, right? Oftentimes our rubrics when coming in just sort of blanket everybody, right? And that's problematic, right? So what we're trying to do is figure out in this next section, how do we individualize that feedback to make not just an authentic assessment, but how do we make sure that those who are engaging in that assessment are going to be able to get meaningful feedback?
And to Ryan's point about language, look at explanation for an example. A lot of that language comes directly from the standards and demands of the standards that we have, our inquiry standards for using evidence, but also communicating conclusions. And what having a common definition would provide for a department is abilities to start to vertically align within your 6th, 7th, and then 8th grade department, or 9th through 12th, obviously. So this provides a common language in which moving from teacher to teacher would provide that consistency, but also common language for the students to use as they start discussing what an explanation is. So as you're moving throughout a class in 6th and 7th and 8th grader, for example, you could start talking about cause, context, or consequence, or talk about how you construct a relationship with topics. These are conversations that students can start to have because the language in these tasks help create the language that you can start having and using within your classroom with your students that would be aligned to our state standards. On our next slide here, this is the bottom portion of the rubric. This is the assessment criteria. Again, this is an annotated version, which we do have provided as a PDF on our website. And to pick up where we left off talking about criteria scaffold levels above. Well, this is those spelled out in more detail. So here we have the scaffold level 1, 2, 3, as you saw above. Those were the scaffold assessment criteria that you were circling and designating to students on specific tasks. Well, here they are laid out and scaffolded again. So we would be looking at being accurate, then clear, and then layer in evidence and reasoning. All language that you see, especially the language you want to look at evidence as an example, that you would see this specific language quite often in our standard. Then we'd be looking at this as a single point rubric. Many people are used to seeing rubrics on a 4-point scale. We've shifted toward a single point rubric. Quite often the goal is being proficient. We would simply put in the language that we would want to see on being proficient in a given topic. So instead of learning what it means to be a 1 and what it means to be a 2 and a 4 and so on, here we are just focusing on the language of what the teacher demands, which is proficiency, and that provides some simplicity with being able to do that. And the students don't have to necessarily learn multiple languages for what it means to be accurate or clear and so on. What we also have here is detractors and enhancers in our single point rubric setup. Detractors are opportunities to provide feedback. They're identifying what, how, why, whatever category that might be in might be a distraction. So you could talk about what was detracting from being accurate, what was detracting from being evidenced. And then the enhancers are providing feedback of what they really did well. They're providing suggested feedback for enrichment, but you're really trying to highlight successes that the student had. So you have opportunities for that individual feedback. Again, if you're using a traditional 4-point rubric, the teacher in the past would maybe be circling a 2 or circling a 3, or on some rubrics, maybe even a 2.5 or a 1.5, and there wasn't necessarily space for feedback. That puts the student in an issue of them trying to interpret what you meant when you circle a 2 or a 4 or so on. What we find in a lot of writing is that there's times within a given paragraph or within a given essay where they might be really clear in doing it well. And you want to bring attention to that. But there's other times they might not be so clear. And we want to obviously target that. So having a space for targeted feedback for each assessment criteria allows the teacher to provide short but specific feedback to the student to make those incremental changes to improve their writing. The last part I would like to feature here is that these are also hyperlinked on our main documents that we have, again, on our webpage. And why we do that is we try to elaborate and explain what these terms mean. We, again, are trying to provide a common language for each of these situations in which teachers in their PLCs can start to have these conversations. So just like with the language of the task, we have language within our assessment criteria, using evidence as an example. Is it corroborated? Is it weighed? Is it decided? This again is creating language for the teachers to have common conversations. Does 6th grade see weighing evidence in the same way that 7th grade sees it? And how can they scaffold that understanding for their students? And again, this creates an opportunity for students to start using our disciplinary language of weighing and citing evidence in a disciplinary way within the class, in which students can start having conversations about what it means to corroborate and how they corroborated their evidence and weighed their evidence and so on. Brian, any thoughts on the criteria section?
You know, it's so important to get the language correct, right? And by correct, I mean calibrated among a group. If students walk into one class, they go to another, and the teachers are demanding different things, it's got to be mind-numbing for the kids to try to figure out what each teacher is trying to do, even within the same subject area. Now, I get how there could be differences in different disciplines, but in the social studies, you know, we always want to make sure that our claims or our explanations or generalizations or descriptions are accurate, right? We're living in a world where truth is being attacked. We want to make sure that things are accurate. We want to make sure that the language they're using is clear, right? This academic vocabulary is incredibly important, but it also depends upon the audience in which you're writing. Too often, I think, we have our students writing to us as opposed to their peers, right? Where it's much more accessible and much more fun to write. The last two, evidence and reason, that's what everybody sort of gravitates to, right? But as Vincent has already said, how are we making sure that students are actually adopting the language of the discipline in order to talk about their assessments? It can't be authentic if they're not using the discipline, right? Disciplinary language of that subject matter, right? And when it comes to being able to give pointed feedback, this does it to a T. No more just, as Vincent said before, circling a 2.5, whatever that meant, right? And burdening the student with trying to figure out next steps. You can actually provide very pointed feedback and saying, this is what you can do, right? And especially when it comes to writing or speaking or visual, which this rubric can do all of those things too, we're able to make sure that we're able to give that very personalized feedback for those small incremental improvements to change the skill level, right? The ability level, the knowledge level of kids over time.
Thank you. So we've actually created several different ways in which you could view this, because we know in the world of NPI, a lot of teachers are using Google Slides quite often more than they did in the past, especially for relaying possible assessments. We've organized this rubric a couple different ways that people can use it within Google Slides, and we're happy to make more for any teacher need. So here we see one version of the rubric where you can lay out the task and they can simply check these boxes and make it clear. This will be handy maybe at the beginning of the lesson to show the students at the beginning what the task is, that they're doing maybe an explanation could be checked, that it would be verbal or written by the end of class, which scaffold level they're doing. But also here we layer in that point that Ryan made, is who's the intended audience for this? Again, this is providing the definition and for the task and along with the assessment criteria. Here's another way to look at it, just like you would see, or very similar to what you would see in the Google Doc version, which is Detractors and Enhancers with the assessment criteria again in the center, where a teacher could use a variety of technology to leave comments in. They could type it in for a student. They could leave voice memos for a student. There's a series of technology and add-ons that they can do if they would like to do it that way. This last one that I'd like to show you is actually requested from a teacher. So they said, I wanted the students to be able to type onto the rubric and see the assessment criteria right next to the response, along with the detractors and enhancers that they wanted to use. So it can all exist on one slide as the student's writing it, but also as the teacher scoring it, they can see the response and leave all the same information on one slide. So we varied this up a couple different ways just to show this rubric is flexible with how you can review it to students. We'd like to briefly talk about our elementary scaffold rubric. It's the same structure as you've seen before, same annotations in many ways that you see. The only real shift that I want to quickly point out is the language for these tasks actually does shift. Again, what we did for this is we looked at the inquiry standards specifically for 2nd through 5th grade and pulled in as much language as possible to align to the demands and ask of the standard. One example here you can see is explanation. It goes from a statement that constructs, and the specific language in the standards in elementary talks about it being a cause and effect relationship. And then one of the standards also talks about that it has a requirement to be in a correct sequence. So what we've done is brought in that exact language for that example, just to point out that has the similar structure, except they just shift a little bit with the language to make it more accessible for elementary. Again, the scaffolded assessment part here looks exactly the same, but again, we shifted the language to bring in language from the elementary standards. But the structure is still exactly the same with single point rubric, enhancers, and hyperlink terms. What we would like to do here is provide an opportunity to demonstrate how we can provide meaningful feedback on an assessment in this example. So again, I've taken one of our slides here and put in the task at the top. I've checked this for the students where they can see that it's a generalization, that it's written, that we're going to be assessing whether it's clear and accurate, and that the audience is for students within their class that would be reading this in this example, along with the definitions again that are provided right here. And what I would like to do is read along with me, but I will read it out loud for you. So this is straight out of a 5th grade example that we have. This is a supporting question at 5th grade level again. It says, why do we celebrate the 4th of July and Juneteenth? This is from our curriculum framework, this supporting question. The formative performance task is asking them to summarize why we celebrate the 4th of July and Juneteenth. And here we've provided a student response, which I will read for you, but take a minute to read and process. Also, we celebrate both things because they are special to people. Juneteenth is almost a celebration of the end of slavery, but it is sad that it was delayed from when they were actually free. The 4th of July freed us from England, not enslaved people though. And so this is an example of a student response that we would see for a formative task, which again, the formative task is demonstrating their knowledge for that supporting question. Brian, would you like to talk about some of the ways in which we could demonstrate feedback that a teacher can give on the rubric?
Yes, I love being the mean teacher who's going to make sure that my kids can write more effectively. So imagine then you've got this student response, and it says some stuff, right? But it may not say it in a way that we want to be able to sort of move forward, right? So looking at the first criteria, is the information provided? Information provides a reasonable interpretation of sources. Okay, so specific details of the holidays, right? Are they saying anything about this, right? They don't really talk about specific elements of the holidays. Maybe they could do that, right? It might provide some distinction between the two to tell us more about what those holidays really are about. Some of the terms, I just noticed, Vincent, we missed one here. We celebrate both things. Is a holiday a thing? Maybe we could just say we celebrate both holidays, right? That might be a very easy shift for students to see because students sometimes like to use this very vague language. The term almost, right? We see this in the second sentence there, right? Juneteenth is almost a celebration of the end of slavery. But no, Juneteenth is the celebration, right? That is the way of celebration. And then we could point that student back to two sources that they used to reaffirm what they're looking at, right? So it's not because, Mr. New just is trying to be a mean guy. It's, let's take a look at what the evidence is saying, because that's exactly what that criteria says. Information provides a reasonable interpretation of sources. I'm going to point them back to the sources, right? Actually freed, right? Now we're talking about the way that they're using some of their language, right? When is a person free, right? Was a person free all along, but they were enslaved by others, right? What is the point of view of this student as they're writing this, right? These are things that we can start to bring out. Now, listen, I'm not saying this is the first time that I'm going to be giving the feedback to a kid on this level in this, but it's going to take some time to develop a relationship, right, to where you can give more and more pointed feedback, and the students start to recognize, Mr. New's not just being a mean guy, he's actually trying to help. If we're able to see, I don't know what happened to our screen there, Vincent. You might need to say something to pull it back to your screen.
Am I not presenting anymore?
No. Yep, there you go. It kept going back and forth a little bit on my screen. Over on enhancers, right? This is good. They're using some good language. Maybe they've heard the teacher or some of the sources use the word enslaved people versus slaves, for example. This is an important understanding of what was done to people. And then when we see the sorry, Elaine, I think that it keeps cutting back to you.
No.
That there's accuracy in.
It's doing fine. Yep.
Okay.
Sorry. That
there's accuracy in the There's accuracy in the correlation of the true holidays, right? When it comes to the clarity of the language, right, this is where we can start to fit much more into the language itself, right? So the use of the word sad, for example. Maybe we should use more descriptive words that capture the perseverance and the resistance, right? So maybe we could use the word not just, right? But it is not just that it was delayed from when they were actually freed, right? Versus just, allowing a student to sort of say that. I think that's a very important distinction about making sure that what they're saying is accurate to what they want to say, right? A great suggestion here. Let's combine the last two sentences. There's no reason why, right? Those two sentences need to be separate. This might be a good combination to provide greater clarity for an idea, right? Than having it segmented in two different ways. And also, who is the us? Who is the they? One of my favorite teachers the other day was giving some feedback, and he just kept talking about the pronoun use, right? You guys keep using all these pronouns, but we have to be more specific with who we're talking about. Are you talking about the colonists, right? And especially something that students tend to do, specifically in the social studies, is they talk about the us, right? When we were there, but not everybody was represented that same way. Not everybody identifies with that certain history. And that could be problematic language for students to be able to use that and become conditioned and habituate towards using that language in claim making, right? Or in this case, a summary. But we also want to applaud the students, right, for being able to say, look, you're using great academic language, right? Being able to use Juneteenth, being able to use England, right? Being able to use the 4th of July. Those are very specific factual information elements that were part of those sources, right? And that an audience would definitely need. Right. So these are just one example, right, of a teacher providing some solid feedback, right, to a student, so that they can then shift their understanding, right, over time. Right. You'll notice here that there's nothing in the red that would have ever been on a 4-point rubric where you're circling numbers. Right. And that oftentimes a rubric like this is designed to improve students' ability with their skill. The other types of rubrics, right, where you're just circling numbers, is there to get a score, right? And we want to make sure that we're making that distinction, because any kind of authentic assessment will be destroyed, right? It'll be undermined without a quality rubric to provide feedback to move those folks forward and to be able to continuously scaffold their learning in future assessments.
And Ryan, I just think that's a great point of understanding the student identity of who they are and where they're at, that this isn't feedback you would necessarily give on the first assessment, that even what you're doing here to demonstrate what we've discussed in the presentation is that it might seem like low-hanging fruit to point that they're using the 4th of July and Juneteenth as terms, but when you see it in the enhancer, you're encouraging that behavior, encouraging that language in our discipline, but then they'll see that instantly in the distractor that they're using the term us. And so they kind of contrast each other, and you're nudging that student to make incremental changes within their writing.
Yeah, and I think that, listen, writing is the hardest thing academically our kids are probably going to do, right? And that it's super important for us to make that a central element, because one of the reasons why writing is so difficult is that students really take to heart that this is their identity being expressed. That's why it's difficult for them to share out their writing, both by turning it in or by verbalizing it in some way. But ultimately, what they say is who they are, right? And we have to be able to make the students, give them enough skills and ability and experiences to improve the version of themselves that they want to see, right? And giving that feedback is very difficult, right? But these are the types of feedback that we think would be effective of moving students towards, being greater citizens, as well as great people.
I believe we're getting close to the end of time, but I just want to feature that we have some key objectives that we noticed here, that we're trying to provide formative performance tasks that provide consistent feedback for students to improve literacy and mastery of standards, that we've done our best to align our rubric along with the inquiry standards that are provided. That this is rooted again that in our inquiry and disciplinary standards, but we're also scaffolding to construct arguments, that ultimately our goal is for our students to be making arguments, and our formative tasks are scaffolding those skills to build to that argumentation piece. And then again, that our tasks are creating criteria for expectations for this, and it's bringing coherence around a specific language so teachers can start vertically aligning themselves around common language so they can also start calibrating with each other, even across grade levels, because the rubric and language would be common and consistent with that PLC work.
Excellent. Well, listen, please reach out to us, Ryan.new, Rebecca.ingram, Vincent.tinker. We'll be joining you guys later on this afternoon with one of our teachers who've been using this rubric, Daria Ochanowski from Newburgh. And so we'll look forward to seeing you guys then.